Hello, and welcome to this first very awkward, probably only, not just first, episode of Comic Scholars. I did actually run a Twitter poll, and of all the options I picked for a title, a lot of you picked another Crisis event, which I was going to use, but considering this first episode happens to be about a Crisis event, I thought that it would set the wrong tone, so that I would only be looking at Crisis events. Like, no, I'm looking at superhero comics. So, sorry, that's what you guys picked, but the second one that won was Comic Scholars, so we're going with that. And as I may have just given away, this episode I want to talk about Crisis on Infinite Earths. So a little background before I get started. So I've been reading superhero comics for, I think, most of my life. I've been reading comics most of my life, I know that, and I've enjoyed superhero project stuff since I was a little kid. Batman the Animated Series was a big part of my childhood. The Superman animated series I watched some of, but it doesn't get as much airtime over here. X-Men the Animated Series was a good one. The Spider-Man in the 90s, and a little bit the 90s Fantastic Four, which I keep forgetting is a thing, and then it randomly pops in my head. But at this current point in my life, I am actually a doctoral student looking at comics, specifically the first 4 Crisis events. So I thought a brilliant place to start when just talking about comics from a scholarly point is Crisis on Infinite Earths, which is my first case study. But I think that unless you were around at the time, it is difficult to truly comprehend just how impactful and brilliant Crisis on Infinite Earths truly is. And I say this having not been around at the time. I was born in 93. But when we truly talk about major events, and at the time I'm recording, it's also 2022, so we're in the middle of another Crisis event. But from our position, we have so many events to compare it to, so that we can't really truly pinpoint just how special Crisis on Infinite Earths truly was. That's why I want to focus on it today. I want to truly express how important and brilliant the story is from both a history and academic standpoint. I'll state up front that I don't think it is the best story, and it does require a lot of work on the reader's part. But it plays into just why this story is impactful and why it is done so well. I'm writing this as Dark Crisis is just starting, we're 1 issue in, and it's pretty good. But especially with the lead up to Dark Crisis, we can see just how much DC has grown to rely on what Crisis on Infinite Earths created. It is truly a testament to what Marv Wolfman and the late George Perez did with their work. But Crisis on Infinite Earths is the very first Crisis event, and thus it's where we get the Crisis name from. At this point, there are 9 Crisis events, including what has been dubbed an Anti-Crisis. So we have Crisis on Infinite Earths, 0 Hour Crisis in Time, Infinite Crisis, Final Crisis, Flashpoint, Convergence, Dark Knight's Metal, Dark Knight's Death Metal, and now Dark Crisis. Dark Knight's Death Metal is the so-called Anti-Crisis, but in reality it's just another Crisis event. For anyone who isn't aware of what a Crisis event is, they're event comics in DC that fundamentally alter the continuity of the main timeline. This is why Identity Crisis and Heroes in Crisis are not counted as Crisis events, despite having Crisis in the name. In the past few years, DC seems to have ramped up the amount of Crisis events, and I think because of this, the reason they were originally created has sort of been lost to the general public. In the introduction to modern reprints of Crisis on Infinite Earths, Marv Wolfman talks about just how much research he had to do in the lead-up to writing Crisis. And the reason for this is that Crisis wasn't just an event as we know it today, but rather its purpose was to provide an in-universe explanation for a full line-wide reboot. Typically when we think of an event comic now, we think of a story that is a slightly larger scale and with a lot of tie-ins. The biggest offender of this I can think of is 2016's Civil War II. If you're just reading the main issues, then it's only 9 issues, but if you include all the tie-ins, spin-off miniseries, and the Free Comic Book Day issues, then that's 135 extra issues. And I'm not saying that a lot of tie-ins is a bad thing, But in the case of Civil War II, a lot of these tie-in books actually had nothing to do with the primary story. Some outright ignored the event and continued the plot of the respective series. Officially, Crisis on Infinite Earth has 56 tie-in issues, all collected in the Crisis on Infinite Earth companion volumes. But the key difference is that these issues all have some way of tying into the core event, regardless of the genre or tone of the series. The core reason for this is that Crisis on Infinite Earths had the purpose of ending the current timeline and resetting the universe for a new generation of stories. The reason all these stories could tie in so well is because they needed to deal with the cataclysmic consequences happening in each Crisis issue. Their stories were coming to an end, and they needed to provide some form of an ending for characters. It brings to mind this story that Jeff Johns told on the Kevin Smith podcast Fat Man on Batman, where when he started picking up comics, he brought an issue of The Flash that was happening right as Crisis on Infinite Earth started, and he got really sad that it said that this was the last issue, and it sort of told him to carry on reading in Crisis on Infinite Earths. He went over to Crisis on Infinite Earths and found that the character he really loved had just died. But that's the thing, it was the core series pointing to here's where you need to go to find out why the series is ending. It was very conclusive in its own way. But I think this could be compared to the much later Flashpoint event, which was another crisis that reset the timeline. The key difference here is that the series running in DC had a chance to conclude with Crisis on Infinite Earths because it was entirely planned. With Flashpoint, the tie-in issues were all set in the Flashpoint universe and expanded on that side of things. With the then main universe, there wasn't a main plan to reboot everything. The reboot we now call the New 52 was a decision that largely came out of nowhere if you were just reading the comics and not paying attention to industry news. The main reason for this is that Flashpoint was originally conceived as just a Flash event. It was then retooled to be a Crisis event and reboot continuity. We can still find adverts and promotional images that confirm the series was supposed to continue and that Flashpoint was just a Flash storyline. But going back to Crisis on Infinite Earths, the idea of touching every corner of the DC universe is central to Crisis. You can see from just the first issue that many now obscure heroes and villains appear. The first time I read Crisis, it was the appearance of the original Outsiders that confused me. At the time, I thought I was well versed in DC continuity, and this was the moment where I realised there's always more to learn. And I'm still learning now. There are whole, vast parts of the DC multiverse that I do not have a full comprehension of, even though I've been essentially studying them for years now. So the Outsiders appear alongside the Teen Titans here, which does give you some indication of who they are, but at the time, they were kind of a big deal. This was the team formed by Batman when he left the Justice League back in 1983. If you're interested, you can actually get the run in 3 hardcover collections, and it's pretty interesting. And given it was worked on by Mike W. Barr and Jim Aparo, it's definitely worth a look. But this is the kind of thing that makes me love Crisis on Infinite Earths. No corner of the DC universe remains untouched. Every aspect is referenced and brought together to really sell the magnitude of the situation. Crisis is full of these moments. One of the first things we see happening is the destruction of Earth 3, the home of the crime syndicate. These are characters who had appeared very sparingly at this point, but the choice to destroy their world first is very telling. Firstly, it sets up the character of Alexander Luthor, who comes into play later. But secondly, these were characters that already had a connection to the then building idea of the DC multiverse. I've mentioned the multiverse before, but I think before we go any further, it's important to outline just where the multiverse stood at this point. Obviously, during the 2020s, we have such a thing as the map of the multiverse, which I honestly wouldn't mind a poster of. But we also have Grant Morrison's Multiversity, the Dark Multiverse as seen in Dark Knight's Metal and Dark Knight's Death Metal, and we even have Elseworld stories and an entire anthology series entitled Tales from the Dark Multiverse. But back in the Crisis days, the multiverse existed but wasn't as widely discussed. The purpose of the multiverse back then was essentially to wave their hand over continuity problems, or to allow themselves to continue stories from intellectual properties they'd acquired. Let's use Shazam as an example. So, Captain Marvel, the character we now know as Shazam, not the Marvel character, He was created by C.C. Beck and Bill Parker back in 1939 as a direct competitor to Superman. And for a while, he actually outsold Superman. And a core reason for this is most likely wish fulfillment. While Superman appealed to kids, Captain Marvel was a kid who could essentially transform into Superman. It's a very long story, but due to similarities and direct market competition, DC ended up in a court case with Fawcett Publications, the then owners of Captain Marvel, which ended in the series being cancelled, and eventually DC would end up with the rights. However, they couldn't just shove Captain Marvel into the then DC main timeline. So instead, Captain Marvel's stories would take place on Earth S. There would be occasional crossovers, the ones seen in DC Comics Presents are the ones that come to mind mostly. But largely Captain Marvel was left to his own world, and the same also happened very briefly with the Charlton characters DC acquired. These are characters like Peacemaker, the Blue Beetle, and the Question. But the introduction of the multiverse idea spawns from the Flash number 123, Flash of Two Worlds, from 1961. This was the story that had the second Flash, Barry Allen, finally meeting the original Flash, Jay Garrick. Back when Barry Allen was introduced in the Silver Age, it wasn't really touched on while this version of the Flash was being introduced and what happened to Jay. But in Flash number 123, we get our answer. They exist on two separate universes. That separate universes exist that all resonate at a different frequency. It's actually a fascinating subject in itself. I remember reading Michio Kaku's Physics of the Impossible as a teenager, which was something that really resonated with me, and no pun was intended there, I swear. But after Flash number 123, DC started to really use this to drive storylines. Not long after Flash number 123, we got Crisis on Earth 1, Crisis on Earth 2, and Crisis on Earth Prime. This is how we get the name for Crisis on Infinite Earth. It was following the naming conventions of these stories. So by the time we get to Crisis on Infinite Earths, we have a basic understanding of what the multiverse is. But we also know that it's not touched on nearly to the level that we look at it today. I want to stress that Marv Wolfman and George Perez really did their homework when it came to planning and executing the event. The first issue of Crisis on Infinite Earths essentially acts as a means of explaining to the audience just how many worlds are out there, and give a sense of the scale this series is going to encompass. We see Harbinger traveling to different worlds in order to collect heroes to help in the upcoming battle. This is where we see characters like Blue Beetle and Firestorm having the adventures interrupted and taken to the Monitor's base. Introducing characters like Blue Beetle and the other Charlton characters among the other characters, this signals to the audience that while yes, they are introducing characters you may have seen from other companies, they are just as important right now as both the existing and new characters introduced in Crisis on Infinite Earths. Jumping back to the character of Harbinger, I think they did introduce her in the CW TV series when they did the adaptation of Crisis on Infinite Earths. Personally, I didn't watch the crossover. I did see a clip on YouTube of Kevin Conroy as Bruce Wayne, though. My ongoing love for the animated series means that I obviously had to see it. But for Harbinger in the comics, she acts sort of as the Monitor's herald, to borrow a term from Marvel. Think of her as like the Silver Surfer to Galactus, but Galactus being a good guy watching over the universe in this case. Watching over the multiverse, rather. You might recognize her if you've been reading the recent Infinite Frontier or Justice League Incarnate miniseries, where she doesn't actually appear, but her name and form is used as the basis for the computer mainframe seen in the House of Heroes. Using Harbinger as the mainframe computer in the House of Heroes is actually a really clever use of intertextuality, specifically optional intertextuality. And this is where I might lose a few people, so I'm very sorry. But intertextuality is just a really fascinating area of academic discussion, and something I think merits a lot more discussion in superhero studies. Basically, you can think of intertextuality as being the practice of one text referencing another, and it's often paired with Roland Barthes' idea of death of the author. But since intertextuality forces you to look at the older text in the context of the new one, but there are three key forms of intertextuality, namely obligatory, optional, and accidental. Obligatory is something that you absolutely have to reference in order for this new text to work. Think about when you see a comic, film, or TV series parodying another. That older text is obligatory here since it's 100% has to be referenced for the joke to work. Optional, which is the form I see here, is where the new text is referencing a specific older text, but it's not completely needed for the audience to understand what is going on, and for the audience to understand it. Another example in Infinite Frontier is right in the last issue. The heroes are sort of bound in chains, and the Calvin Alice Superman breaks out of them, and the image is directly homaging Neil Adams' cover for, I think it's Superman number 244, but I probably have that wrong. But it's a direct homage. It doesn't impact the story, but it's a case of, hey, here is an optional reference we've put in. If you get it, you get it. So the Harbinger computer seen in something like Infinite Frontier is referencing Crisis on Infinite Earths, but the reader doesn't need to expressly know Crisis on Infinite Earths to understand that reference. It's just a computer. It happens to resemble a woman. If you do recognize the reference, which is completely optional, then you can appreciate the reference and perhaps get a little more out of it. The last kind, accidental, is just that, accidental. This can be a reference that the reader notices that might not have been meant by the author, or even one that the author didn't realize they'd made. With superhero comics, I think the primary accidental reference that is made is in costume design. Since Superman is considered the original superhero, many costumes take inspiration from his. However, this also means that people taking inspiration from Superman are also accidentally referencing Circus Strongman, which was the inspiration for Superman's costume. But going back to Harbinger, the character, her real name is Lila Michaels, and she was originally found by the Monitor as a young child floating in the ocean. So the Monitor saves her, and she's now essentially raised by the Monitor on his satellite, and helps to study the multiverse. Her powers are pretty interesting, and if they do ever bring her back properly, I'd be very curious to see what they do with her. But she has biofission, cryokinesis, and the ability to travel dimensions as well as superhero reflexes. Basically, she can split herself into 20 copies, though this also divides her power among them. She can travel freely back and forth through time, as well as freeze time when necessary. And finally, she can travel through dimensions. With these abilities, it's very simple for her to collect the heroes the Monitor needs. However, because of each of her copies is weakened than the original, one is infected by a shadow demon, the creature working for the anti-Monitor, and when all the copies of Harbinger recombine, this dark presence now whispers to her, which is what ultimately causes the Monitor's downfall. We see the shadow demon attack Lila right in the first issue, and it's not made exactly clear just what's going on, but it lends to this amazing sense of dread that lurks in the background. The shadow demons do sort of come back in later Crisis events, most noticeably Infinite Crisis, but Infinite Crisis is also the one that intertextually most leads heavily on Crisis on Infinite Earths, although the lead up to Dark Crisis is giving it a bit of a run for its money. Another figure we begin to follow early on is Pariah, and his real name is Kelmosa, but it's incredibly rare that he's ever referred to by this. In fact, the only reference I can think of is when he's doing a flashback to his origin and talking about how this all happens. Someone calls him Kel. But he is the last survivor of his world, and when we first meet him, he seems to be appearing to worlds that are about to die, and then disappearing right as they fade out of existence. Back in his home Earth, he was an absolutely brilliant scientist who wanted to unlock as many secrets of the universe as he could. And he conducted an experiment to attempt to witness the dawn of time. And during his experiment, however, he accidentally freed the Anti-Monitor and began the wave of destruction that caused the Crisis on Infinite Earth storyline. As punishment, although he perceives it as being punishment, he is forced to watch as each Earth dies one by one. And it's eventually revealed that it wasn't truly his fault, but it is something he feels deep guilt for, which is what we're now seeing in Dark Crisis. But the idea of looking back and observing the dawn of time, somehow causing destruction, I kind of consider this an example of observer effect. The idea that by observing certain reactions in physics, you're altering the outcome. In quantum mechanics, this can be seen with the wave function collapse, where it's been proposed several times that measuring the events causes a discontinuous charge which cannot be reversed over time. With Crisis on Infinite Earths, I propose that by looking back at the birth of everything, even through time, he's fundamentally altered the wave functions and causing it to collapse, which is what brings about the antimatter wave. I'm not a physicist. I find these things absolutely fascinating. My degrees are in interactive media and I guess media history, so it's all best guess. But it's elements like this that really gets the brain running and trying to learn more about the real world. This is a big reason why I'm an advocate for so-called disposable and popular media. Anything can spawn curiosity in people, and it's stuff like this that made me want to read more as a kid, especially when it comes to science and maths. But Pariah and Harbinger are two major characters that came out of this story that both have had ramifications on the DC universe without being heavily reused, which is fascinating in itself. Harbinger, I think, only reappeared maybe twice before she became a reference to a floating computer. She appears in Millennium, where she's apparently depowered, and then I think she's killed somewhere around Infinite Crisis, where she's living on Paradise Island. Pariah is seen in Infinite Crisis very briefly, and again in, I think, Blackest Night. But what's currently going on now with Dark Crisis is the first time he's being heavily reused, which is why I kind of have high hopes for Dark Crisis. But one of the characters that Harbinger does pick up, who ends up switching sides very early, is the Psychopirate. And Psychopirate did exist before this. He first appeared in 1965's Showcase number 56. But I want to draw attention to something that is done really well here. Perez has a fantastic command of paneling and using it to both condense information and provide this super compelling flow. And Psychopirate's powers come from the Medusa mask, which allows him to change the emotion of those around him. And as Harbinger is coming to get him, she moves the mask across the room onto Psychopirate's face. And this is done in a series of panels that both maps the space between Harbinger and the pirate, but also tracks the motion of the mask. Perez does this a lot throughout Crisis, and the most prominent is probably the scene depicting Flash's death, as well as the few times he's popped up early on. So when Flash dies in the later half of the series, it's stated that he's rippling back through time, which explains why we see his dissolving body appearing throughout the story up to that point. But Perez uses that same fantastic trick of keeping a panel focused on one fixed point, while showing the gradual change of the object in question. It's a trick you've probably seen before, and the way Perez uses it is iconic, to the point that Justice League number 75, The Death of the Justice League, mimicked Perez's structure with Batman, Wonder Woman, and Superman's supposed deaths. Currently, I'm dancing around talking about the Monitor and the Anti-Monitor, because I want to address them separately at a later date. Mostly because I want to look at how their use has changed from this first event to now. Obviously, when they were created to simply kickstart these events, and now years later we find out that they're actually 2 of 3 children of Perpetua, and there's a whole other stuff going around, and then in Final Crisis there's multiple monitors, and then there's Nyx Wotan. There's a load of stuff to do with the monitors that I want to address separately. But I guess my primary concern here was just talking about why Crisis on Infinite Earths is so important and how that's being reflected in just this first issue and the lead up to Dark Crisis. And I know it's been a lot of rambling. I'm very nervous about doing this. But it is something I strongly believe needs to be addressed, and I hope that I can do this just a little bit more in the future and maybe expand on things. I'll probably go back, listen to this, and think it's terrible. But I want you all to remember that Crisis was the first of its kind. What we're seeing now in Dark Crisis is, yes, another Crisis event. And I can see why you guys wanted that to be the title of the podcast, I'm sorry. But it's hard to sort of acknowledge just how important and well done Crisis on Infinite Earths was for its time and what it spawned. I'm looking forward to more Dark Crisis stuff coming out because it means that we get to pick apart just how it has impacted everything. But hey, that's just my thoughts on this weird book without even going into the plot. So maybe next time we'll dig a little bit more into the plot. I just wanted to talk about the surrounding elements for now. So keep reading comics.